The 12 Labors of Heracles and Echo and Narcissus. By Geraldine McCaughrean, illustrated by Tony Ross. The 12 Labors of Heracles. There was once a baby born who was so remarkable that the gods themselves stared down at his cradle. He was called Heracles, and when huge snakes slithered into his crib to strangle him, he knotted and plaited them as if they were pieces of string, and threw them out again. For Heracles was strong, fantastically strong, stronger than you and me and 100 others put together. Fortunately, he was also gentle and kind, so that his friends had nothing to fear from him. His schoolteacher made him promise never to touch alcoholic drink, though. If you were ever to get drunk, Heracles, the schoolmaster said, who knows what terrible thing you might do with that great strength of yours? Heracles promised, and he truly meant to keep his promise. But then his friends all drank at parties, his family always had wine with their meals. It seemed foolish for Heracles to ask for fruit juice or water. So he was tempted to take just one glass of wine and no after that another and another and another. Soon he was roaring drunk, throwing punches in all directions. When the wine's work was done, Heracles' own family lay dead on the floor, and Heracles was an outcast hated by everyone and most of all by himself. For his crime, he was condemned to serve King Eurystheus as a slave for 7 years. Eurystheus was a mean, spiteful man whose kingdom was overrun by a great many problems, and he decided to set Heracles the 12 most dangerous tasks he could think of, tasks that were to become known as the 12 Labors of Heracles. A giant lion was terrorizing his kingdom, eating men, women, and children. "Go and kill the lion, slave," he told Heracles. Heracles was so miserable that he did not much care whether he lived or died. He found the lion's den and strode in, with no weapon but his bare hands. When the beast sprang at him, Heracles took it by the throat and shook it like a rug, then wrung it out like washing. When it was dead, he skinned it and wore the lion's skin for a tunic, knotting the paws around his waist and shoulders. If King Eurystheus was grateful, he did not show it, but simply set Heracles his second labor. "If you can kill lions," he said, "you may as well try to kill the Hydra." The Hydra was a water serpent which lived in the middle of a swamp. When it was born, it had 9 heads. But each time one was cut off, 2 new heads grew to replace it. By the time Heracles came face to face with the Hydra, it had 50 heads, all gnashing their horrible teeth. Heracles was quick with his sword and nimble on his feet. But though he slashed through many snaking necks without being bitten, the struggle only became more difficult. The heads just multiplied. So Heracles ran off a short way and lit a fire. Then he heated his wooden club red hot and, with his sword in one hand and his club in the other, he re-entered the fight. This time, as he cut through each neck, he singed the ragged end with his red-hot club, and the head did not regrow. At last the Hydra looked like nothing more than a knobbled tree stump. There was no time to rest after fighting the Hydra. King Eurystheus sent him to capture a stag with golden antlers, then to kill a huge wild boar. Heracles' 5th labor was a particularly unpleasant one, to clean the Augean stables. Lord Augeas kept 1,000 animals penned up in sties and stables stretching the length of a foul valley. He was too idle to clean out his animals and too mean to hire farmhands. So the wretched beasts stood up to their bellies in dung. People for miles around complained about the smell. Heracles stood on a hilltop, looking down on the valley, holding his nose. He saw a river bubbling close by, and it gave him an idea. Moving boulders as easily as if they were feather pillows, he built a dam, so that the river flowed out of its course and down the valley instead. Startled horses and cows and goats and sheep staggered in a torrent of rushing water, but the dung beneath them was scoured away by the river. Heracles only had to demolish the dam with one blow of his club, and the river flowed back to its old river bed. The animals stood shivering and shaking themselves dry, in a green, clean valley. King Eurystheus was ready and waiting with his next 3 commands. Heracles was to destroy a flock of bloodthirsty man-eating birds, tame the mad bull of Crete, and capture the famous wild horses which could run faster than the wind. By now the king had begun to feel very nervous of his slave. He had a big bronze vase made and hid inside it whenever Heracles came back from doing his work. "The mad bull is tamed, master. The man-eating birds are now dead, and your wild horses are outside in the ad yard," said Heracles, when he returned soon after. "What must I do next?" But Eurystheus was running out of problems and his mind turned to thoughts of getting rich with the help of Heracles. "Get me the jeweled belt worn by the queen of the Amazons," said the king, from inside his urn. Here was one task for which Heracles did not mean to use his great strength. He simply went to the queen of those savage female warriors and explained why he was there. She took an instant liking to him and gave him the belt straight away. Unfortunately, word spread through the camp that Heracles had come to kill the queen and he had to fight 1,000 angry women, fierce as wasps, before he could escape with the jewel belt. And so it continued. No sooner did Heracles finish one task, than he was set another one. To fetch King Eurystheus the legendary giant oxen, Heracles made a bridge over the sea by bending 2 mountain peaks out across the water. To fetch Pluto's 3-headed dog, Cerberus, he traveled down to the fearful underworld. But the 12th and last and greediest of the king's commands was for Heracles to bring him the apples of the Hesperides. These magical fruit grew on a tree in a garden at the end of the world, and around that tree coiled a dragon which never slept. Even Heracles, with all his courage and strength, quailed at the thought of fighting the dragon. Better by far that a friend should ask it for the fruit and be allowed to take them. So Heracles went to see a giant named Atlas. Now Atlas was no ordinary giant, as big as a house. Atlas was the biggest man in the world, and towered above houses, trees, cliffs and hills. He was so tall that the gods had given him the task of holding up the sky and keeping the stars from falling. The sun scorched his neck and the new moon shaved his beard. And for thousands of years he had stood in the one spot. "How can I go to the end of the world?" said Atlas, when Heracles asked him for the favor. "How can I go anywhere?" "I could hold the sky for you while you were gone," suggested Heracles. "Could you? Would you?" "Then I'll do it," said Atlas. So Heracles took the sky on his back, though it was the heaviest burden he had ever carried. Atlas stretched himself, then strode away towards the end of the world. The gardeners were being members of his family. Fetching the apples was no hardship. But as the giant hurried back across the world, carrying the precious fruit, he thought how wonderful it felt to be free. As he got closer to home, the thought of carrying that weight of sky seemed less and less attractive. His steps slowed. When at last he reached Heracles' poor exhausted, bone-bent Heracles, Atlas exclaimed, "I've decided. I'm going to let you go on holding up the sky, and I'll deliver these apples to King Eurystheus." There was a silence. Then Heracles grunted, "Fine. Thank you. It's a great honor to be allowed to hold up heaven. But if you could just help me get a pad across my shoulders before you go. These stars do prickle." So Atlas took charge of the sky again just while Heracles made a pad for his shoulders. He even gave modal Heracles the apples to hold because he needed both hands. "Well, I'll be on my way now," said Heracles, juggling with the apples as he scurried away. "Most grateful for your help. Perhaps next time, you'll get the better of me." After 7 years, Heracles' hard labors came to an end, and he was free. But he was never free from his sorrow at taking that first glass of wine.